Came back from the Isle of Wight, tiny little island on the south coast of England. My mom died over the holidays. And I knew that if I had called you all up and said, you know, I just can't make it, I just can't do it, you would have said, that's okay. But I work in the news business, and when we've got a deadline, we've got a deadline. And I could hear my mother saying, you've made a commitment. You're going to have to be there. But make sure you leave early enough. If the ferries don't run in that little piece of water, if there's fog, she was obsessed with being on time. Make sure you leave early enough. She would make us leave a whole day early if we had to go over the other side of the water. The Isle of Wight is 22 miles wide. So that's the equivalent of going up to Mount Charleston to get over the other side from my house. Imagine if your mom made you go a whole day early. There might be traffic on the way to Mount Charleston. So we had my mom's services on Tuesday this week. And what did I do? I left right after, and I went a whole day early so I could get to Gatwick Airport. And that was the airport that got shut down by the drones. So maybe she should have worried about drones and not fog. But I tell you this because I want to talk to you about my relationship with my mother and how central the news was to that relationship. She looks a bit like the Queen, doesn't she, my mum? My mum never went to college. She was a stay-at-home mom from 1960. She never drove a car. I don't think she could even ride a bicycle. She never used the internet. She never used a smartphone. She never used a cell phone. But she was engaged with the world. And our relationship was so much about exchanging ideas about the news and how we felt about it. My mother read a printed newspaper every day. She read the Isle of Wight County Press, the local paper that came out every week. She listened to BBC Radio News in the morning and watched BBC Television News in the evening. And she was engaged in a world of ideas. That little island was not a limitation for her. And she lived in the world of mass media, an era that really is in the rearview mirror now. Her chosen mass media, printed newspapers, have now fallen below how social media functions as a choice for news for Americans. And look at that line for television. We don't watch news events as a group on television anymore. Think of the big news stories of the last 20, 30, 40 years, and there are examples when a lot of people, millions of people, watch news stories all at the same time. Think about the Boston bomber, the search for the perpetrator of that outrage. Think of 9/11, of course. Before that, the O.J. Simpson trial, the President Clinton impeachment. Back in 1969, 700 million people watched on television, estimated around the world, when the United States put a man on the moon. You know, the only thing that we watch on television together anymore is actually football, Super Bowl. So my mom lived in an era of mass media, and it served her really well, because mass media allowed people to have a shared understanding of the facts. And you knew what was important because that was what was on the front page or the top story in the evening news. So you could exchange ideas, you could talk to people, you could form opinions based on the same set of facts that you agreed on. Okay, now the bad part about mass media is that power that controlled it was in very few hands. The people that were able to make those decisions about what was on the front page and what was the top story in the news, very few of them. And many, many voices, the great diversity of our country, many voices were not represented in mass media. So we have a ton of media now. We have a ton of ways to find news. I find this really exciting, that if you are younger, and a little caveat here, this research calls people under 50 younger. If you're younger, you are getting better at distinguishing between fact and opinion when it comes to news stories. I think that's really great. And if you want, I'll be happy to share the quiz with you if you want to try this out for yourself. It's all about, can you tell the difference when you hear statements about immigration, about taxation, how the federal government works and political things? Can you tell the difference between an opinion statement and a fact? I find it really exciting that younger people are getting better at doing this, even though there are so many sources of news. So, guess what? It was the older people that were spreading fake news on the internet. Not my mom. She never used the internet. Not her. So older people, and a small percentage of them, were responsible for the dissemination and the sharing of a lot of really damaging material in the 2016 election cycle, some of which was outright conspiracy theory, and some of it disincentivized people from going to the polls. So I'll stop for a little commercial break here. More news sources than ever to choose from. I'm really happy that so many people are choosing NPR. 30 million people every week listen to our network of radio stations, of which KNPR is your affiliate, your NPR affiliate. Another 20 million on top of that interacts with NPR through digital platforms, podcasts, apps, and so on. That's really great that people are choosing our trustworthy independent news. I like to think that I'm in the business of empowering people to connect with their communities, connect with one another, and be empowered to understand and act on their world. So that, I think, is good news. Not so good news is that the dominance of social media companies, the executives behind them, have been slow to recognize that their platforms were used in this negative way. I don't know about you, but I'm not that confident that they know how to stop it. Let's layer something else on top of this. We have an administration that thinks journalism and journalists are the enemy of the people. We're not the enemy of the people. Hey, journalists are not your friends, necessarily. Their job is not to tell your side of the story or a story the way you'd like it to be told. Journalists are the advocates for the people. And at its best, journalism is the advocate for democracy. Journalism gives voice to people who don't have a voice. Journalism asks uncomfortable questions and holds people in power to account. They hold power accountable. That's what journalism does. Sure, we get it wrong sometimes. And we admit our mistakes, and we vow to do better, and we're transparent about that. And journalism is analysis. It does get refreshed. It's often called the first rough draft of history. Journalists, the enemy of the people? They're the people that give voice to those who don't have a voice. People like my mom. People like you. People you work with. So, the last time I spoke to my mom was on the 23rd of December. And it was exactly what she wanted to know, this headline. How could a drone cause so much chaos at an airport? And she asked me if there had been any disruption at Las Vegas McCarran Airport. And I told her that yes, there were people stranded because of those direct flights that go between Gatwick and McCarran. Imagine if McCarran Airport had been shut down for 3 days. That would have been chaos. Gatwick Airport is probably 3 or 4 times bigger than McCarran. So this was typical of the relationship I had with my mom. She'd call every week, and we would talk about what was in the news. And for 30 years since I've lived in the United States, this is what we did. And she would call up recently and say, "What is going on?" About what, Mom? And she would have something to say about something happening in the news here and expect me to sort of walk her through it so she could form an opinion. Or she would get antsy with me because I wasn't following along every single detail of Brexit. And this is what we did. We exchanged ideas. My mom never went on a plane. She never went 250 miles away from where she was born on the Isle of Wight. But she wanted to understand, and she wanted to live in the world of ideas. And she didn't want to have an opinion that wasn't based on facts. And she got her facts from trustworthy news sources. And when she had an opinion, she acted on it. My mom was the little old lady who would sit in the polling place and make sure all the voting went well. My mom would go door to door collecting for charity. I never once got a Christmas card from her that wasn't a fundraiser for another charity or cause that she believed in. So that was my mom. She wasn't limited by being on that little 20-mile wide island. And that was because she kept up with the news. So a couple of stories that NPR did recently that really exemplify what I mean when I say journalism is the voice of the people. We're the advocates for people. NPR did a deep dive with ProPublica and found the shocking conclusion that women in America are more likely to die in childbirth or have a near fatal experience than in any industrialized country. That's shocking. Don't you expect that your parents, your mom, your sister, your partner will be safe when they go to hospital? That's not unreasonable, is it? Here's another one. NPR went through a lot of data, talked to a lot of students that were enrolled in a program where they thought they were getting grants to go to teacher training. And in exchange for doing teacher training, getting the grants, they would go and teach in distressed areas and work with at-risk kids. Well, somehow something got messed up and those grants got turned into loans just because some of the students had tiny errors on their paperwork each year. And so instead of being able to pursue their passion, these students were saddled with thousands of dollars of debt to the federal government. They thought they'd gotten a grant. Thanks to NPR's reporting, congressional hearings are taking place to find out what went wrong and to fix it. That's what journalism does. These two fine fellas on the right here, David Gilkey and Zabi, they were murdered for doing journalism. Murdered by the Taliban in Afghanistan a couple of years back. Murdered for doing journalism. Somebody wanted them to not report on what was happening there. Enemies of the people? They're not enemies of the people. So what I want to leave you with is talk about the news with your friends. Talk about the news with your family. Develop opinions about the issues that you care about. Find the issues that you care about. And just by doing that, you're going to feel engaged. And maybe you'll find something that you care about so much it'll become your purpose. Because my relationship with my mother, it took her into a world of ideas when she was on a tiny little island in England. And being engaged with the world through the news took me all the way from that island to being here with you today. I just don't know where it could lead you, but I think it could be somewhere really great. Thank you.